Growing up, and when I was in my own elementary school, teachers were always moving my desk away from my peers, my distractions, hoping that I'd finally stop talking. But it never mattered where they put me, I just couldn't. At home, my mom was always saying, stop biting your nails, stop dribbling the basketball in the kitchen, stop making noise or singing the same song on repeat. It was always stop, but I always couldn't. And then blank everything. Have you ever tried really hard to focus on something that you're entirely uninterested in? For some students, that's what school is like. Imagine being a kid and your success depends entirely on doing just that every single day, all day. It wasn't until my second year of teaching that I made a connection. After a year where students were sent home and they were learning from home, and something clicked for me. When they returned and they came back into my classroom after months of being stuck at home, for most of the students, they were excited, distracted, restless. For most of them, that went away after a week or two, except for one student. He really struggled with his transition. He struggled with the expectations, the structure, the long stretches of sitting still. And I found myself asking a different question. Not how do I get him to behave, but what would I have needed? That's when I really came to the realization. So as a 23-year-old adult is when I realized that I had a connection deeper with him. ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is a neurodevelopmental condition that affects the way the brain regulates attention, impulse control, and activity levels. But what if attention isn't the problem? What if the problem is that we've designed classrooms for one kind of mind? Roughly 1 in 10 students have ADHD or attention-related deficits. One of the biggest barriers in education is that teachers aren't adequately trained to identify or understand ADHD or attention-related deficits. Not because they don't care, not because they're not skilled, but because the systems haven't given them the opportunity or resources to do so. Much like my own experience, in my early grad program, ADHD is talked about very briefly and often as a greater topic of learning disabilities. It's often theoretical and entirely disconnected from the reality of a classroom full of 7-year-olds. As a result, many new teachers know the mainstream definition of ADHD without being given the opportunity to understand practical strategies for managing attention challenges in the classroom. They show up with a passion to teach all students without a clear framework for what that actually looks like in real life. Where's the problem deepens? ADHD doesn't always look like what we would expect it to. Sometimes it's not always a student that can't sit still. It's a student who's looking out the window, missing instructions. Maybe it's a student who starts work and can't finish it. Maybe it's a student who seems capable 1 minute and entirely disengaged the next minute. And without proper training, it's really easy to misinterpret those behaviors as laziness or defiance or lack of discipline, but it's not. They're signals of a brain that's really struggling to manage and regulate emotions, attention, sorry. And without a level of understanding, it can be really hard for teachers to stop and pause and think, this could be ADHD, or this student might need a different approach. And then they rely on classroom management strategies that were never made for neurodiverse learners. And they repeat things like sit still or pay attention or try harder. And then frustration builds on both sides. It's estimated that by the age of 12, students who have ADHD receive 20,000 more negative self-corrections or comments from their parents, teachers, or other adults than their same age peers. And students feel misunderstood and teachers feel like they're ineffective, and then a gap begins to grow. Early identification is important because it's recognizing the patterns of ADHD before they become deeply embedded. And early intervention provides the tools and supports for students with ADHD to become successful in a variety of environments and in the future. Students affect ADHD, but not what? Inattentive, hyperactive, and impulsive behaviors often are seen as students' character and not a need for support. Some symptoms can look like traditional behaviors, but with more intensity and more frequency. So sometimes those concerns aren't taken seriously. But in most cases, student evaluation processes can vary from district to district or school to school. But typically what this looks like is taking your concern to the team The team then makes a plan for intervention and data collection. They meet later then to analyze that data and decide if they want to refer for evaluations. Sometimes parents are communicating with pediatricians, and that pediatrician might ask the teachers or adults that work closely with them to fill out an ADHD diagnostic rating scale. But in both cases, the results are then used to guide instruction, intervention, and supports. Boys are diagnosed nearly 3 times as much as girls because their behaviors are presented as more disruptive than their same age peers that are girls. Because of this, girls are often not diagnosed until significantly later in life and even into adulthood. But here's what's critical. A lot of classrooms are still structured in the traditional teacher-led way. And students that have struggles with executive functioning and sustained attention often look like disruptive or off-task behaviors, which then get resulted with disciplinary actions. So they're spending more time outside the classroom when really they should be spending more time in the classroom. They're at a higher risk for falling behind in reading, writing, and math, not because they can't learn, but because the structure of how we're teaching doesn't support how they learn. If attention needs aren't met, then the disruptions are then increased, which impacts all the learners, not just the student with the behaviors. Students who have ADHD often experience repeated failure and negative feedback, which can also cause them to feel more anxious, have lower self-esteem, become entirely disengaged from learning at an early age entirely. So early identification can change the entire trajectory of a student's education. Students are trained to recognize patterns of ADHD, and they're able to respond differently. They might shift their corrections to curiosity or shift their thinking to change their discipline to supports. And they might notice that the student who doesn't finish their work might actually struggle with task initiation, or the student who can't sit still is actually using movement to regulate their focus. And that shift, as simple as it seems, can be extremely life-changing for both the teacher and the student. Because a child who is understood doesn't grow up thinking, I'm bad at school. They grow up thinking my brain works differently and I can work with it. And it's not just about training teachers, it's about giving them the language, the awareness, and the confidence to see what's actually happening. Because when they recognize ADHD for what it really is, they're not just managing behaviors, they're unlocking potential. Attention is influenced by a lot of things. Like, it's not something you have, it's not a fixed trait, you don't just have it or you don't have it. It's influenced by environment, emotional connection, relevance, movement. And when any of those elements are missing, attention fades for anyone. But people with ADHD experience that mismatch much more intensely. As a first-year teacher, I spent a lot of time observing in veteran teacher classrooms. And when I would go in there, I would observe, I'd watch closely, I would observe for, structure, routine, strategies, classroom management, and I use this observation to change my growth and help me in my teaching practices. But as I was setting up for a parent conference one day, I realized that all the chairs that I had that I was setting up were not really ideal for most adults, and especially for an important meeting. And so as I giggled to myself, thinking about my principal sitting on a half-ball rolly stool or a kneeling chair, I asked myself, if I spend my day in environments that are allowed for flexibility, why would I expect something entirely different from my students? In many of the classrooms that I observed, students were expected to sit still, quiet, not moving, and learning and focus in a very specific way. The more that I reflected on that, though, the more I wondered, does learning really require this level of stillness, or have we just created environments where we equate stillness with success? And so I started to wonder, if students are standing and moving and fidgeting, but they're learning and they're engaged and they're completing work, does it really matter how they're positioned? And so at that moment, I started to challenge the assumption that learning has to look a certain way to be valid. Instead of trying to fix the student, we can just redesign the environment. So let's make it real. You walk into a classroom that's designed for attention diversity. First, you might notice that not all the students are sitting still. Some are standing, some are in cushions on the floor, some might be fidgeting with a toy or chewing gum, maybe even listening to music, depending on the age, really. And instead of chaos, you notice focus, because movement isn't being punished, it's being used. Second, let's talk about the lesson itself. Instead of a 45-minute lecture in the front of the room, you break that into shorter learning chunks. And then you might start with a brief explanation, an activity, a reflection, or a discussion. And then attention is reset naturally over and over. Instead of being expected to sustain attention endlessly, they're being invited back into it. And then next you might notice choice. Students might be working together or by themselves. Maybe they're working on something visually or building something or using hands-on materials. And then when they have a sense of control, student motivation is increased, and motivation also drives attention. Next, there's stimulation, not like an overwhelming level of noise. Maybe it's varied lighting or low background music or some sensory tools to use with hands-on stuff. And then, because with students with ADHD, any brain with ADHD needs a certain level of stimulation to stay engaged. And in this redesigned space, differences are normalized. No student is singled out for needing a break or needing a fidget, and then it's just part of the classroom culture. And so then students start to change how they see themselves. They don't see themselves as a problem anymore. They see themselves as a student and a learner who just needs something different to be successful. Because fair doesn't always mean that every student has the same thing. It means they have what they need to be successful. Sometimes the smallest changes can make the biggest differences. Like small work interval. It can be as simple as it seems. You hand a student a worksheet with 20 questions, and it might seem super overwhelming, and they might avoid it entirely. They might start and get distracted. But if you break that into shorter chunks with breaks, say 5 questions with a quick break, it might start to seem more manageable. They might build momentum, be more likely to finish the task and complete the work. Not because the work got easier, but because the structure of the way you're doing the work supported the way that they learn. Last year, I started a new job teaching in a new school, new grade level, new everything. And as I was getting ready for the school year, other teachers were teaching me about some of the things about my new incoming students. One student in particular was described as difficult, challenging, disruptive. So I was prepared for the worst. And at first, everything I saw confirmed everything they told me. But then I realized from the outside it looked like defiance. But the more time that I spent with him, the more I noticed something deeper. I saw the constant nail biting. I saw he was constantly seeking sensory input. He was really intensely focused on certain things, but not others. And then I realized it wasn't just behavior, it was communication. So instead of trying to label his behavior, I started trying to understand it. I started to change the language that I was using, the way that I was responding. I tried to anticipate his needs instead of responding to his behavior. And then things slowly started to change. It didn't go away overnight, but the big behaviors became less intense, less frequent, less overwhelming. But most importantly, something else started to happen. We started to build trust. And that level of trust changed everything. It didn't mean that everything got easy. It didn't mean that they went away entirely, but it did mean that learning became possible. Creating a space where students feel seen, understood, and allowed to have the need to have different things as their peers. I saw a shift in his, not just his behavior, but in his relationship with learning entirely. After that, I made it a priority to take all the things that I had learned about him and communicate it with the other adults in his space. And I also kept a constant communication with his parents so we could all consistently support him in the same ways. And this quote from his mom earlier this year is a reminder of why that's important. It's the least I can do for how much you've helped our family in the last few years. Without you, I'm sure my relationship with my son would be very different because I would never have been able to understand him. And maybe understanding isn't the problem at all. I mean, maybe behavior isn't the problem at all. Maybe understanding is. Because when students are surrounded by adults who are aligned, who understand them, who respond with intention, everything changes. It's not just a vision, it's backed by research. Studies show that physical activity improves executive functioning and self-regulation. Multisensory instruction also improves memory and comprehension. And student choice improves intrinsic motivation and learning outcomes. But here's what's really important. That all of these changes don't just support students with ADHD, they help all students. Because when we design classrooms for distracted minds, we're really just designing classrooms for human minds. And when we design classrooms with distracted learners in mind, we're not lowering expectations, we're just removing barriers. And when we remove those barriers and they're gone, it allows more students the opportunity to do what they were always capable of doing. Engage, learn, and succeed.